Leonard Peltier is a North American Indian extradited from Canada, largely on the basis of fabricated evidence. He was tried in the United States and convicted of the killing of 2 FBI agents in a shootout on a South Dakota reservation 12 years ago. To the American judicial system, Peltier is just a murderer. But big questions remain about FBI tactics during the trial. As a result, a campaign to win Peltier's freedom has involved church and government leaders in many parts of the world. And in the Soviet Union, Leonard Peltier is front-page news, portrayed as an innocent victim of a ruthless political system in the United States.
To the Spirit who dwells in our hearts.
A weekly candlelight service at St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City. With all the ritual of a high Episcopalian service, the saints' blessings are invoked for what Very Reverend James Morton calls modern-day martyrs.
So that the experience of being in prison is very much a part of the experience of God's people. And so when we think of Leonard in prison, and we think of Nelson Mandela today, 2 men who stand before us as bearing witness, but bearing witness in chains.
Nelson Mandela, jailed in South Africa. Leonard Peltier, doing life in Kansas. It's become a crusade. Free Leonard Peltier. And outside, carved in the stone of a church so large it's second only to St. Peter's in Rome, carved in the very stone, is the face of Leonard Peltier. It's a face which, on the other side of the world, in the Soviet Union, is as familiar as Ronald Reagan's. It's all over the daily papers. And on television, the Soviets follow Peltier the way Americans keep track of dissidents like Sakharov or Sharansky. A political prisoner in the heart of America. That's the Soviet message.
It's not a propaganda case. It's a real man who is imprisoned, and he is innocent.
TASS correspondent in Washington, Igor Ignatieff, covers the story.
In my opinion, the case of Leonard Peltier was much more, came very unnoticed here because of reluctance of the American press to write and to look deeply into his case.
Nothing but Soviet propaganda. A counter for their own gulag, says Richard Shifter, American Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights.
In the United States, as in Canada, there are no political prisoners. Now, for example...
Well, is Peltier in jail because he was an Indian leader, because he was a troublemaker?
No. He's in jail because he's a murderer.
He's in jail in Leavenworth, Kansas, convicted of murder after a shootout with the FBI. Peltier or Peltier, martyr or murderer? He's a 42-year-old Sioux Ojibway Indian who's served 10 years of a double life sentence. People now, a lot of people in the Soviet Union, and a lot of people in Canada and the U.S., call you a political prisoner. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's believed somebody that's been in prison for their ideology, somebody that's been convicted falsely.
On the other hand, shooting cops is frowned upon most places, ideology notwithstanding.
Right, I believe it's frowned on all over the world. But we got to remember, too, now, the agency that we're speaking about right here was not totally innocent of crimes themselves on the reservation.
The agency was the FBI. The reservation was Pine Ridge in South Dakota. In 1973, at Wounded Knee, members of the radical American Indian movement took over part of the reservation. It started as a dispute between the AIM Indians and the elected leaders, but soon became an armed confrontation with the American government.
What are you going to do now? I think we're going to prepare ourselves for the fight that we expected in the beginning.
We have bet our lives that we can make change for the American Indian, whether we live or die.
2 months later, when the occupation ended, 2 Indians were dead, 2 FBI men wounded. But the fighting between Indians continued, and the FBI increased its manpower and firepower around the reservation. Terrorist tactics came to Pine Ridge, And over the next 2 years, 60 Indians were killed. Most of the murders unsolved. In June 1975, 2 FBI agents drove onto the reservation to arrest someone for stealing a pair of cowboy boots. There was a gunfight with a handful of Indian radicals. The Indians say the agents started it. The FBI says its men were just mowed down. Peltier was blasting away with his high-powered rifle, but doubts he hit anyone. When you get into a gunfight and you're shooting at policemen, whether your bullet actually killed them or not, you're still guilty of murder. You were a part of the gang that killed them.
Well, we were in a gang, for one thing, and secondly, there's a law in this country where you have a right for self-defense, and people believed that they were under attack and that they were defending themselves.
It may well have been self-defense. Who knows?
Federal prosecutor Lynn Crooks made the government's case.
Common sense tells you what the FBI was up to. What you're talking about is 2 guys coming in with service revolvers. You stop a vehicle, you get out, you're intending to find out if your subject is in that vehicle. And these guys on this Indian reservation, without knowing what they're up against, are going to start blazing off at 200 yards with those service revolvers. And then you have a response from these people of that leave 125 bullet holes in their cars. And that's somehow or other supposed to be painted as a picture where our agents started this fight? I mean, they never had a chance. This is absurd.
Within minutes, the 2 agents were dead. First wounded, then finished off at close range.
Somebody literally blew their heads off.
Yes.
Did you see that happen?
No, I did not. No.
That's what you're convicted of doing.
Yes.
Did you do it?
No. No.
Somebody did it, and over 250 state troopers, U.S. Marshals, and FBI agents poured into the area, searching for the killers. Peltier fled to Canada. 9 months later, he was arrested in Alberta and taken to Vancouver for an extradition hearing. The Americans wanted him back. The Indians protested that they wanted him not for murder, but for his politics, and that he would not get a fair trial at home. Nevertheless, Peltier would be extradited, largely on the basis of 2 affidavits from a supposed eyewitness to the shooting. These affidavits were found to be false, but Peltier was sent back anyway. Today, Canada says there was still enough other evidence to order the return.
This is Mr. Hanson, the U.S. Marshal's Office in Western Washington.
Peltier was one of 4 Indians charged. By the time he was flown back, 2 of his co-defendants had already been acquitted on the basis of self-defense. Charges had been dropped against a 3rd. Peltier was the last to come to trial. At the federal courthouse in Fargo, North Dakota, Peltier tried to use politics as a defense. But the judge kept it to murder and went by the book.
I did not receive a fair trial. When the government presented evidence that they knew wasn't factual, that's a form of manufacturing evidence. When I was not allowed to properly cross-examine the witnesses, that is another form of not allowing me to defend myself. And that's precisely what happened in that whole trial.
There was no political case allowed, and some witnesses did admit they had been coerced by the FBI. But on April 15, 1977, Peltier was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 life terms. While Peltier sat in prison, the FBI's conduct was going on trial. Radical lawyer William Kunstler wants a new trial for his client. He says the agency went too far to win this case.
It's important for a number of reasons. They have 2 dead agents, and they want someone to answer for it. Secondly, there's been a vendetta against the American Indian movement by the FBI. They've replaced the 7th Cavalry as the prime source of discontent on many of the western reservations.
But they had to backtrack so many times, it leads one to believe that either they were trying to set somebody up or they're damned incompetent.
They tripped over their feet. That I'll concede. They had too many agents working on the case. They wound up with more paper than they could control. They wound up with more paper than I could control.
5 years ago, the defense got its hands on some of that paper, 12,000 pages of it. One note suggested that Peltier's rifle could not have fired the fatal shots. But the prosecutor disputes that interpretation, and Lynn Crooks says it doesn't matter anyway.
What the law requires us to prove is that this man was a knowing participant in a chain of events which led to 2 dead bodies. We proved that, without that bullet even ever been mentioned.
So far, the courts have agreed. In September, a court of appeal found that while some evidence was wrongfully withheld, the jury probably would have convicted anyway. Still, Peltier maintains that the FBI was just out to get the American Indian movement.
We did find some documentation where once they had the national leadership tied up more or less in the courts and everything, that they were supposed to start concentrating on the people that were below them. And their whole purpose was to destroy the American Indian movement.
An important leader of the AIM movement, given Wounded Knee, given the mood of the times?
This man isn't the leader of the Indian movement, he's a thug. He's basically a thug that is there as a bodyguard for some other relatively important Indian leaders. But he himself is a nobody.
Well, he was a bodyguard. He was hardly an intellectual leader of the movement. Does he deserve martyr status?
Well, we don't want martyr status. We just want a fair trial. Everyone talks about martyr status. We want him to have a fair trial where an independent jury would get all of the evidence, not just that which the FBI wants them to get, while withholding that which exonerates.
No luck with the courts, though. So Peltier's supporters are out hustling world opinion. The Kansas City headquarters for the Leonard Peltier Defense Campaign may be a little shabby, but they've picked up some impressive support.
There's some presidents on the Commission on Human Rights Council of Exterior Affairs in Spain. I believe we should jump on this.
Peltier's just won an award from the Human Rights Commission of Spain.
We have to get off some.
In England, Amnesty International and even the Archbishop of Canterbury have called for a new trial.
I want to do a tour report, is what I want to do.
Right now, they're busy with a tour linking Peltier's plight with Nelson Mandela's. It's being supported by Bishop Desmond Tutu, and the city councils of Detroit, Washington, and San Francisco have passed resolutions calling for the release of both men. The tour is on its way to Canada. And already, 60 members of Parliament have signed a petition for a new trial, among them former Solicitor Generals Warren Almond and Robert Kaplan.
The information was false. This constitutes a treaty fraud.
New Democrat Jim Fulton thinks the original extradition should be looked at, too.
What I want to occur is to have Mr. Peltier returned so that the extradition proceeding can take place on correct, accurate, verifiable information. If he's then extradited on that basis, then so be it.
In Washington, 55 members of Congress have come out for a new trial, along with Reverend Jesse Jackson and other prominent church leaders. Back in Fargo, none of this impresses Lynn Crooks.
Does it frustrate you to see how this cause has developed, this story's developed?
Oh, very much so. Very much so, simply because what I perceive is for some reason a disinterest in justice. The point being that we have 2 dead bodies. We have 2 young men, 26 years old, doing their job, mowed down in their prime. And nobody in their cause seems to give a damn about that. I find that sickening.
I agree somebody did kill the agents.
Stephanie Autumn was Peltier's common-law wife.
I've gone over testimony. I've talked to almost everyone that was there that day, and I know that Leonard is innocent.
Last year, she and 2 other supporters took their cause to the Soviet Union. The Russians pulled out the red carpet for what they called the American Freedom Fighters. Autumn's visits with school kids, factory workers, even the first woman cosmonaut made television news every night. This Soviet news film reports on Autumn's meetings with the Moscow Young Pioneers. In it, she's telling them how much Leonard loves children. They're telling her how much they love the Soviet Union. But when Autumn asked about the treatment of native people in their country, the comradeship cooled.
What we said in terms of translation did not exactly come out as we had said it.
What do you mean it didn't exactly come out?
Verbatim, and in terms of a speech that I had given to Soviet women in terms of their responsibility to environmental pollution and the effect that it has on our children, it was roughly translated that women are lucky to give birth to new men.
Were you worried about being used to cover up the Soviet judicial system, or lack of it from what we understand over here?
No, that was not an issue there. We went to the Soviet Union because Indians going to the Soviet Union gets media attention, and we were hoping that other countries, neutral countries, France, English, non-aligned countries, would pick up the momentum where the Soviet Union would leave off and invite us to their countries and examine the case of Leonard Peltier.
The Soviets call this a politically motivated persecution.
American human rights chief Robert Shifter. You embarrassed by this case? You embarrassed by your government's performance?
No, we are certainly not. The fact of the matter is that the Soviets can dream up any case and make an issue of it, and as long as they control all the media that reach their people, they can sell them on anything. There's no question about that. To the extent to which they have influenced people outside the Soviet Union to think that they have a valid point, all I can say is their propaganda department deserves a certain amount of credit for that, because they have been able to turn a lie into something that has been accepted by perhaps a number of well-meaning people in the West.
Soviet newscasts claim Peltier is simply the most famous of thousands of political prisoners in the United States. Soviet viewers are told about Indian poverty, suicide, and disease, and Peltier is portrayed as leader of the fight against a deliberate government policy of genocide against native peoples. For the last 5 years, regular updates have kept Russians informed on every detail of the Peltier case. And the Russians love anything about Indians. Books on Wounded Knee are bestsellers in Moscow stores. Komsomolskaya Pravda, a paper for young Soviets, has had the most coverage. It carries a regular feature on Peltier and has mounted a huge letter campaign. But Elena Ovcharenko denies the government has anything to do with her young readers' response.
We have the letters, we have the postcards, we have the opinions, and so we have the readers, 15 million readers. And so the young people who are very active, who want to be active, who want to be interested in everything. And so when we have a pile of letters, we are to give a response to the proposals.
The paper claims it has collected 18 million signatures calling for Peltier's release, and they've been sent on to the White House. Conveniently, many of them were delivered during President Reagan's human rights campaign before the Geneva summit. And so when the Americans went off to complain about Sakharov, the Soviets were ready to hammer back Peltier.
We research individual cases.
In New York, Susan Osnos is with the Helsinki Watch, an independent monitor of human rights violations around the world.
I don't think the Soviets could say that Leonard Peltier was the tip of an iceberg here. Whereas if I single out the case of an individual writer who's not permitted to publish what he writes in the Soviet Union, I can, in 10 minutes, make a case that that's the tip of an iceberg. I don't know of a lot of other Leonard Peltiers, and I'll bet you the Russians don't either.
But the Soviet response to this, I mean, they can point at you and say, you know, it's not absolutely clear. It's not absolutely clear that this man got a fair trial because the machinery of government was out to get the Indians.
Well,
prosecutor Lynn Crooks.
Soviet response, as I've heard it, is a comparison between Mr. Sakharov, a Nobel Prize winner, and Mr. Peltier, a thug, a murderer. I don't recall Mr. Sakharov having a trial with 12 jurors. I don't recall him having an appeal. Mr. Peltier has had the best of our system, the best that our system has to offer. When it finally goes through the entire process, what you have is the most recent decision from our appellate court, 3-zip. The man stays in jail.
Do you fear you're being used by the Soviets?
Lawyer William Kunstler.
No, I welcome the Soviet participation. I would welcome participation from any country in the world, anything to dramatize Leonard's situation. And remember, Leonard is not supported just by radicals in this country. He's supported by the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. He's supported by 10% of the American House of Representatives.
Do you think the Soviets really care about Leonard Peltier, or are they using him, using you, to distract attention from their own judicial system?
Eric, they're going to make hay with examples of American injustice. No question about it.
To excuse their own sins.
Well, it isn't. We do it to excuse our sins. And maybe we do have a better tradition here of speaking out and being able to speak out. But that doesn't disguise the fact that you can't do comparison shopping on the question of justice.
I think the Soviets are using him because his case contains a grain of truth, and they need a grain of truth in order to counter the truth of the overwhelming number of human rights violations in the Soviet Union.
They, in prison, are holding up God's justice. They are holding up God's light. And together, the truth of God's mercy and the truth of God's justice can be seen by all people. Amen.